Okay, let's talk about ideologies and upheavals. Follow PowerPoint. Basically, what's going on in this chapter is looking at a time period when you have rising literacy rates, when people are looking around at the societies, the countries they live in, and decided that they want some type of change. They look around and see flaws, and they try to diagnose problems within societies. Think about the role of ideologies today. We have people who are divided politically because they think differently about how society should be organized, what sort of programs governments should support, should enact, and people honestly just have different views of some of these things. So let's look at how these ideologies develop. If you study the French Revolution, you know about Edmund Burke. He was a critic of the French Revolution. This is where many conservatives point to the origins of conservatism, or at least the whole notion of traditional conservatism. With Edmund Burke, who was very critical of the revolution, thought it would lead to disaster, which it kind of did. And he was critical of the French for breaking with the past, for eliminating some of these traditional institutions, for ignoring the critical role of the aristocracy, the church, and kings in providing stability for society. And that's what Edmund Burke believes, is that the past leads to greater stability. You build on the past, you understand in the past, understand what works, and continue doing that. He's very much opposed to radical changes. He's not opposed to any change. Slow, peaceful, gradual change is fine, but radical change, like the French Revolution, where they eliminated the aristocracy, where they tried to recreate a new form of government based on democracy and create a republic of virtue, which led to, at least we're looking at the French Revolution, maybe 1.5 million dying in that. And that was a period of disorder. And then ultimately it led to Napoleon, an emperor. So what conservatives say is you have to look to the past to build on it, to protect these important institutions that keep people from sort of wanting to create a type of government based on their emotions, and one that promises this sort of utopian goal at the end. Utopia, say conservatives, cannot be achieved. So the goal for them, and you saw Clemens von Metternich, if you study Clemens von Metternich at the Congress of Vienna, was to sort of get back to the old way before you had this disaster of year after year of warfare under Napoleon. Now, Clemens von Metternich is really someone who wants to crush dissent. He's not somebody who's going to embrace a lot of new ideas. And as an aristocrat, he's von Metternich. It's kind of self-serving. Aristocrats should rule. I'm an aristocrat. I should rule. So there is a bit of self-serving ideas within this, although Edmund Burke is not an aristocrat. Now we're going to look at another idea that is going to emerge at this time. It emerges in England, but also spreads elsewhere. It's part of the American Revolution, and that is political liberalism. Liberalism, small L liberalism. It has nothing to do with like liberals in America. Liberalism is a different type of government. That is, remember we talked about absolutism and different types of government that emerge, absolutism, empire. Well, liberals say, maybe we should invest power in one individual, a king, an emperor who rules by divine right and rules solely on their own. Maybe we need a government that gives power to more and more people. So it's building on some of the ideas of the past. Liberals, political liberals, support things like a constitution. You should have a constitutional government, not something that typically absolute monarchs would want. They support ideas, and it's a theoretical idea, as equality under the law. All people, regardless of whether they're nobles or commoners, should have equality under the law. They support things like the extension of voting rights. So you can see it's not full democracy just yet, but they believe that more and more people should have the right to vote, primarily people who have property and educated people. And this is where John Locke comes in. John Locke, who defended the glorious revolution in England, he's one of these individuals that says, yes, you should give some political power to people because people are rational. Whereas Edmund Burke said commoners are often irrational and guided by emotions and fall for sort of radical ideas that sound good. John Locke says, people are rational. They'll protect their life, liberty, and property. And what's good for society also, John Locke says, is toleration of different ideas. freedom of the press, those sorts of things, things enshrined in the US Constitution, particularly the Bill of Rights. So when you think of liberalism, don't think of the way the term is used today. Just think of a system of government that's different from monarchy. And it's one that leads to democracy. And later on, we'll see that political parties, as liberal democracies emerge, political parties have different ideas about how to govern these democracies. But democracy is a radical idea at that time. Only a few people who are radical Republicans really support universal manhood suffrage, that is, extending the right to vote to all adult males, not women yet. Even fewer people actually support the right of extending the vote to women. Now, economic liberalism is a different aspect of liberalism. So liberalism has a political aspect, equality under the law, voting rights, a constitution. Economic liberalism supports free markets, laissez-faire, government staying out of the economy, government only doing a couple of things like building up police forces, defenses, a military, and building up certain infrastructural projects like bridges, roads, those sorts of things, railroads that are just too expensive and not terribly profitable. The father of economic liberalism, the father of capitalism is economic liberalism, is Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations, who talked about the importance of a free market, government staying out of the market, not erecting tariffs, letting competition prevail, letting individuals with their own money make their own choices, those sorts of things. Thomas Malthus was also one of these economic liberals. That is, government shouldn't intervene, for instance, to feed the poor. You might run out of food. There's only so much food you can grow. I mean, we know that that's not the case today, but the idea is that government should not do certain things because it's going to make it worse. David Ricardo, one of the iron law of wages. These are people who are calling for government to refrain from getting involved in the economy. Now, at that time, business elites really liked laissez-faire, really liked capitalism, really liked a free market, although business elites also liked it when government passed laws and regulations that protected certain businesses. So they kind of want it both ways. But the idea of economic liberalism is that government should leave the free market to operate on its own. Now, one of the things that happens, it means that government is not going to, or at least going to take a while before it enacts some safety measures, limits the hours of work. I mean, if you have a free market, is it okay for children to work in a free market? Should government step in and say no? Well, economic liberals say no, government should allow the market to operate. And if children work in coal mines, that's fine. Government should stay out of it. We'll see economic liberals change their views over time about how much government they actually want to intervene in the economy. But one thing's going on at this time: workers don't have many rights. Even labor unions tend to be outlawed all over the place. So let's look at some of these ideas in action: conservatism and liberalism. And later we'll get to socialism and Marxism and Romanticism, because these ideas do influence the way people behave. We vote for certain parties because we like their ideas politically and we think they would benefit our society. That's what people do. And if those ideas aren't enacted by government, people begin to protest. Remember, today we can all vote. At that time, very few people can vote. Look at England. England is probably the most liberal society around at that time, but still only a few people can vote, less than 10%. England is where Edmund Burke was from. They were concerned about the French Revolution. They were involved in the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. They don't want that sort of chaos and violence and disaster to befall England. And what you begin to see in England is more and more people, particularly the middle class, particularly educated people, people who have property, demanding the right to vote, demanding some changes. One of the things that happens after the French Revolution, there's some pretty severe economic problems. So the price of bread, the price of food goes up because there's a series of bad harvests. And what you begin to see are more and more protests within England. England is ruled by a conservative government. Very few people can vote for England, a conservative government. One of the things this conservative government had done was create something known as the Corn Law. For us, corn means corn. It's grown in Iowa and elsewhere. That's what we know. It comes on a cob, right? Or in a can. But in England, corn means grain. It just means a variety of different grains. So it could be wheat, could actually be corn as well from America. What this is, it's a tariff on imported grain, a tax on imported grain. so that it can keep out imported grain, so that those who grow wheat, for instance, in England, enjoy high prices for wheat. What does this tax on imported grain what does the tax on imported grain do? It increases the price of things like bread in England. Who wants to pay more for food? So this, Adam Smith would say, this is unfair. Government should not be protecting one group, the grain farmers, over another group, the consumers who like to eat bread. You're making them pay more. So this gets protested. The right to vote gets protested. And what happens is the government is going to crack down. It had a Bill of Rights in England, but what the government's going to crack down. It's very concerned that a French revolution, similar to what happened in France, will break out in England. These conservatives don't want to be overthrown from power. So they pass things like the Six Acts, which restrict freedom of speech, freedom of the press, limits freedom of assembly. A number of people get arrested. There's a newspaper tax. So what they're doing is saying, we want to prevent radicalism from taking over, so let's crack down on radicalism. It doesn't crack down on mass protests. There's one outside of Manchester called a place called Peterloo. St. Peter's Field is where it is, where thousands of people, look at the figure there, 60,000, lots of people protest against the government. They protest against the Corn Law. They protest for more voting rights. They protest conditions in some of the factories. And what England does is look at this protest and say, oh my God, what's going on? Let's send in the troops. And so they send in the troops, some of whom kill a number of the protesters, injure many, many more. That's why it's called the Peterloo Massacre. The government cracks down on its own people who are protesting for change. What's going on here, it's called Peterloo, is because some of these people who participated at St. Peter's Field were also involved at Waterloo fighting Napoleon. But what happens after this in England is you begin to see different people elected to Parliament, to the House of Commons. Younger people, think about America today. It's not, a lot of young people have different ideas about what sort of political system, what sort of laws, what sort of government programs we should have in comparison to older people in America. So there's a generational divide at times within countries. And there's one at this time within England. As you have younger people getting elected, they've read some of these pamphlets promoting political reforms, political liberalism, extension of voting rights. They've thought about, they've read Adam Smith, so they believe that government should not intervene in the economy. So they enact some reforms, and you begin to see, after Peterloo, the government changes. Maybe don't crack down as harshly. Let's enact a few reforms so that we can give the people what they want. And that's one way to avoid revolution. So that's what they do. Tariffs are reduced. The criminal code is softened a bit, eliminating some crimes and particularly harsh punishments for some crimes. Unions get legalized, not strikes, but unions get legalized. Within England, there are a number of different religious groups. Catholics had been discriminated against since the Protestant Reformation. At this time, they started passing laws that say Catholics can enter certain professions that they were once banned from. And that's similar to rights given to non-Church of England Christians, non-Anglicans. Slavery gets outlawed in England and the British Empire, although it's slavery wasn't widespread at all in England. But England has lots of people. Another thing governments begin to do is they limit child labor. That is, they enact new laws because they held a number of commissions listening to what some of these children actually had to deal with, working long 15-hour days in the coal mines and how it affected their lives. So they end up passing laws known as factory acts that limit the workday. Age 10 to 13, you can only work 9 hours a day. We might think that's crazy. A 10-year-old working 9 hours a day. Well, that's a major reform at that time. That's something unique in the Western world. And the same thing with ages 14 to 17. You can work 12 hours a day. So you can see at this time, it's an important reform. It's nowhere near what the reforms we have today are. One of the other things that happens is people begin to agitate for voting rights, particularly the middle class. They're educated, they have property. And what they want are changes to the districts that allow members of parliament to be elected. Parliament goes back to, at least the House of Commons goes back to the Middle Ages. And some areas had representation in the Middle Ages. but don't need it now because there are very few people there. That is, this age of industrialization creates massive, massive cities. Population grows dramatically in a number of cities. Those new cities weren't around in the Middle Ages, so they don't get to elect members to the House of Commons. So the middle class wants to change this. They want to get rid of what's called pocket boroughs or rotten boroughs. They're a bit different, but let's think of them as the same thing. A pocket borough is a place that has very few people, but still gets to elect 2 members of the House of Commons. So some person there has the vote in his pocket. He controls the vote. A rotten borough is a borough that is very similar, small in number. It needed representation in the Middle Ages, but maybe one family owns the entire district at that time. So they keep electing family members over and over. So pocket and rotten boroughs. They want these to change. They want the new industrial urban areas to have representation in the House of Commons. And because voting rights have been extended a little bit, England has different political parties. It's got a conservative faction and a liberal faction. The Whig Party are the liberals, and they push through something known as the Reform Bill that doubles the number of voters. Again, you had only 8% of the population, you double that, you still don't have most people voting. But it increases the number of voters and eliminates most of those pocket and rotten boroughs. What you can begin to see is England is embarking on reform, slow, piecemeal reform, and England is going to avoid the sort of revolutions that we're going to look at elsewhere in Europe. Another thing that gets started, protests against the Corn Law. They want tariffs abolished. Why? England has to import a lot of food. You import a lot of food that makes it expensive if you have taxes on that food. And ultimately, the Anti-Corn Law League is successful in getting the Corn Law abolished. So you have free trade a bit prevailing. A 10 Hours Act for adults limits the workday. And there's also a movement called the Chartist Movement or the People's Charter that has a list of demands on it about things that need to change, including things like pay for members of the House of Commons. If you didn't have salaries for members of the House of Commons, only the rich could serve in the House of Commons, for instance. The biggest demand, though, is for universal manhood suffrage. That is an idea that is too soon. Democracy in England, it's too soon. But you will begin to see ultimately, once you start giving more and more people voting rights, it's hard not to give it to most people. And you'll see even women later on demand the right to vote as well. And there's a little ticket to a anti-corn law demonstration. So England is going to embark on a series of reforms that actually keeps England from having a revolution, unlike the rest of Europe. We're going to see revolutions break out again in Europe. Europe loves its revolutions, particularly the French. They tend to like revolutions. So let's look at France at this time. France is going to be led by Louis XVIII. Louis XVI died in the French Revolution, as did his son. So they recognize his son as the legitimate heir. So we'll just give this new guy another name. His name is fortunately Louis. Most kings of France tend to be named Louis or Charles or something like that. So here's Louis XVIII. Comes to the throne, likes being king, doesn't want to do too much to irritate the people of France. He remembers the last king had his head cut off, so he has to be very, very careful. He's there with a 2-house legislature. He's in charge. The elites are in charge. They have limited voting rights in France, but some of the gains of the revolution are in place, like religious toleration, freedom of speech, theoretical equality under the law. There is a strong, powerful group in France called the ultra-royalists. These are super, super conservative nobles and others who want essentially the restoration of absolute monarchy. They don't support anything like democracy. And you can imagine, people, we might think that democracy is the greatest form of government. Imagine what the French thought after the French Revolution, when you have so many people, so much turmoil during that time period. You end up with dictators who have these crazy ideas about how to organize society. In Napoleon. So France, even well into the 20th century, has this strong conservative faction that supports a strong man, a military leader or a king in charge of France. Louis, he likes being king, lasts about a decade, doesn't do anything spectacular. He's replaced by Charles X, who does do some things spectacular. He forms an alliance with the ultra-royalists. He wants to be an absolute monarch. He wants to limit voting rights. And it's not going to work out well for him. So he's super, super conservative, wants to support absolutism, and is going to lose control of France. There are economic problems in France. And remember, oftentimes economic issues, just the price of something going up dramatically, affects people more than ideologies, more than ideas about change and how to organize a government. So what you have are more and more people agitating because the price of food keeps going up, more and more demonstrations, more and more people take to the streets. Charles tries to crack down, but he can't do anything about it, just more and more people. And he loses control in France. And he remembers what happens to Louis XVI. Louis XVI had his head cut off, so he flees France. France is going to get a new king, and they pick a fairly moderate guy, a guy by the name of Louis Philippe, who calls himself King of the French, King of the people, not King of France, but he's a man of the people, a king of the people. He's also called the bourgeois king because he's kind of a businessman. He dresses like a businessman with a top hat and coat and tails. And for a while, Louis Philippe governs France with nothing dramatic going on. Now let's look at another ideology. We talked about conservatism already. Let's talk about, and we talked about liberalism. Let's talk about nationalism and how it affects certain countries. Nationalism, this whole notion, when we think of nationalism, Americans often think of nationalism as a form of patriotism. You know, they're a bit different. Nationalism is tied to ethnic identity. And what nationalists believe is that there is something important about the ethnicity and the culture that grows from a particular ethnic group that makes it distinct and often better than the culture of another ethnic group somewhere else or within that same region. In Germany, nationalism becomes very, very prominent. Germany does not exist. And I just said Germany, I mean the German states where Germans live. They sometimes call it the fatherland. It's actually a confederation of independent German states. There's no country called Germany. There's a country called France. There's one called England. We even have America at that time. There's no country called Germany. And so what you begin to see are nationalists within Germany pushing for the creation of a united country called Germany. If all these other people have their own country, we need our own. And nationalists in Germany take great pride in German culture, the German language, music produced by German composers, the highest literacy rates in Europe. So they admire what Germans have created. If Germans created all this cool stuff, we need our own country, say these nationalists. What the nationalists don't like, they don't like multiculturalism. Nationalists do not think that diversity is our greatest strength. You would never hear that slogan from a nationalist, especially a German nationalist at that time. In fact, what they see is multi-ethnic groups, that is, a variety of different ethnic groups within society, causes division and turmoil and often leads to violence and warfare. It's destabilizing. So what they believe is that countries should be united and organized around a specific ethnic group rather than a bunch of different ethnic groups. So you don't want a multi-ethnic Germany. They want a Germany only for the Germans, not the Poles, not the French, not anyone else, but just Germans. So that's what the nationalists are. It's often an us versus them. Now in Germany, nationalists embrace some different ideas. Most nationalists don't particularly support absolute monarchy, which you see in some German states like Prussia. Most nationalists tend to be liberals. So they want a Germany that extends voting rights to these educated, rich Germans. They give them voting rights. Some of the nationalists even support full-blown democracy. But when we look at nationalism, and I mentioned some of this us and them attitude. And what is a nation? American Indian tribes used to conceive of themselves as a nation. They didn't actually have a geographic region with distinct borders that separated them from each other. But it was their shared culture, the common language, the common culture that made them a nation. So they're bound together by a shared identity and ethnicity. And that's what nationalists believe. And nationalists, as I say, see other ethnic groups as different. Oh, you have a different language? You are not us. So there's this idea of us versus them. It's an exclusionary ideology. Sometimes it leads to notions of racism because, hey, we Germans are superior to everyone else. Look at you French in your silly little language. It's not as masculine and martial as the German language, for instance. They'll say those things. They'll identify certain characteristics that they think make themselves unique over others. Remember, some of these characteristics are just invented by people who tell others that, yeah, you're different from others, you're better than others. So it's myth making, and mythology is important to nationalism as well. But it's going to lead to movements to build nations, build and create nations. As I said, you got France, you got Spain, you got England, which is part of Great Britain and Ireland. You got Sweden over here. You got Denmark, Russia over here. The Austrian Empire is a multi-ethnic empire, lots of divisions. And those different ethnic groups within Austria don't particularly like each other. And there are 11 major ethnic groups within Austria. Over here is the Ottoman Empire. But notice this territory here. This is the German Confederation. It's composed of independent German states. Prussia is the biggest German state. But you got Hanover, you got Bavaria over here. You've got different territories over there. You got Mecklenburg up at the top. And also this land right here, we know that's Italy. But notice there's no country called Italy. It likewise is a divided region as well. Nationalists are going to come along a little later to create a new country called Italy, that Italians should have their own country. So another thing, another ideology that's prominent at this time is called socialism, still kind of prominent today. Socialism, it's really a reaction to the harshness of early industrialization when they see masses of urban poor living in filthy condition, working long hours, brutal hours, getting injured on the job, dying on the job. Socialists look at this and say that needs to change. What industrialization is doing, it's making some people really, really rich at the expense of most people. So socialists say we should not do what economic liberalism says and have the government stay out of the economy. Instead, socialists say, no, government should be very much involved in the economy, organizing the economy, creating plans to make society better. And a lot of these socialists believe that, yes, if you create the right plan, we will have an ideal, perfect society where we all get along and love each other. Nobody's going to be richer than anyone else. We're just all going to share things in common. That's what socialists support. They also support democracy. They also support public education, but often the common ownership. Who gets to own land? Who gets to own any natural resources? Who owns the coal mines and the coal that comes out of that? That sorts of thing. Who owns what? What socialists tend to say is everybody. There should be common ownership of this stuff, so we share, everybody shares in the wealth equally to some degree. Now, they believe in blueprints, and if you follow a blueprint, you're going to have this perfect society. That's why they tend to be called utopian socialists. And where are most of these utopian socialists? They're active in France for the most part early on. France has a number of these different thinkers. And they have and by the way, socialists don't agree. They actually disagree on how to achieve these ideal societies. They look good on paper. You can make anything sound good on paper. And that's what these people do. They're very well educated. They think about all this stuff and they figure out ways they can achieve greater cooperation and greater equality. Now, liberals will talk about the importance of equality under the law. Socialists talk about the importance of economic equality. We shouldn't have vast differences in wealth. And so you end up with a number of socialists like Count Henry de Saint-Simon. Let's get these sorts of people, get everybody together, the business owners, the engineers, scientists, and workers, and figure out how to properly coordinate society. And what he wants is government very much involved in hiring people to work. That is, through public works or anything else. He thinks government should put people to work. Nobody should be unemployed, and everybody should have, I don't know if he would be saying terms like living wage, something like that, but everybody should have sort of equality of economic opportunity at that time. So they're more equal. Charles Fourier is another one. He's a guy who says, the ideal society would be a collection of these little communities that have about 1,700 people. And he's a mathematician, so he worked it out. It can't be wrong, that sort of thing. That are self-sufficient and share and all the profits that may be produced there, but in all of the labor activities as well. Charles Fourier is an interesting guy. He's also a key figure who promotes the emancipation of women and questions the role of traditional families. That's what you see with a number of socialists at that time, that the family itself is oppressive. Women, liberate yourself, and there's no reason not to have sex before marriage or to sleep with as many men as you want. That's what Fourier says. If men do it, you do it as well. That's the emancipation of women. Robert Owen actually tries to, he's a businessman who actually tries to create one of these societies in Scotland. So he's a factory owner, and he organizes a community in Scotland where you have a lot of cooperation, where you have a lot of sharing, and particularly sharing in profits. It's not economic equality, but there is cooperation, and there are high wages, and there are schools and hospitals and churches. There are things that the business owner who might keep all that wealth to himself instead of building this stuff does. So he believes in factories that produce lots of profits, not making factory owners super, super rich, but giving them the opportunity to build these institutions that help ordinary people, particularly workers. It lasts and works for a while, and then it kind of falls apart, you know. It's hard to get people to cooperate at that time. And then there's this guy that comes along, a guy by the name of Karl Marx. He's the one who called these socialists utopian. He says they don't really understand socialists. They have a bunch of crazy ideas. It looks good on paper. They don't understand history. They don't understand how society operates, how society works. So he says they're utopian. They just believe in all this crazy stuff that'll never happen and that shouldn't happen as well. Now, he's a guy who writes a lot. He's a German, but he writes most of his stuff in England. He's got his another businessman who actually supports him, a guy by the name of Friedrich Engels, who owns businesses. His parents owned businesses, and he saw condition of some of the workers in these businesses, and he was horrified. He says, man, this has to change. He and Karl Marx are going to get together. The result of this is the Communist Manifesto and some other writings later on by Marx, Das Kapital. And what Marx says is that if you want to understand society, you have to look at who has power, who doesn't. You have to look at who holds power, who holds wealth, and who doesn't. And what he says, history is really the history of struggle, a struggle between different groups for political power and for resources. All history is the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. So if you go back to, say, ancient Rome, it would be the patricians versus the plebeians. In the Middle Ages, it's the nobles versus the peasants. And at this time of industrialization, it is the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. The proletariat is probably on another slide. The proletariat, there it is, the proletariat, the working class. The bourgeoisie is kind of a term he has for the business owners, upper management, and their allies in government. They control society, they run society, and they organize society to their own benefit at the expense of most people. So it's looking at power relationships. And he asks these questions, you know, why is society organized the way it is? Why do some people have wealth and why don't some others? Well, he says, because what's going on really is that people are competing over resources, and the bourgeoisie and the rich have earned the bulk of these resources. They're the wealthiest, and they create a society that protects their wealth and political power. What he says, you know, societies don't just pop up organically on their own. They are organized by people, by one group to oppress another group. And what he says, you know, resources are finite, money is finite, and that's why people clash over this. That's why there's a struggle to get money, because there's only so much. He's actually wrong about that, and a number of other things. But that's why you have this class conflict, and that's why the rich often pass laws that protect their vested interests, you know, that sort of thing. And he says at this time, he says, man, this is the worst time of class conflict, because it looks like the factory owners, the bourgeoisie, and their allies in government have won. They control most of the wealth and all of the political power. So he says, what workers have to do is understand, develop some class consciousness, understand that they are actually in a war. They may not think that they're in a class war. They may think they're just going to work for wages and go and make some money to drink some beer and go home and do whatever. No, they're in a class war where the bourgeoisie intentionally pays them as little as they have to and oppresses them and passes laws and controls society to control them and gives them ideas like religion that tells them, don't worry about your condition now, you lead a good life even when you're poor. What's important is that the afterlife and your soul lives happily ever after in the afterlife. Or nationalism. What business owners might say is, we need to go to war against the French because those French are a bunch of SOBs. And Marx says, no, the French workers are no different than German workers, are no different than Russian workers, are no different than workers in England. They are all members of the proletariat, and wherever they are, they are oppressed. So they're trying to divide people in order to maintain their power. And Marx says that unions themselves just look for little meager gains, like a fewer working hours, for instance. Marx says you have to understand the system. You've got to overthrow the bourgeoisie. They're not going to give up their wealth and power. You're going to have a revolution, he says. So he's very critical of a number of things. And Marx actually has some interesting criticisms of capitalism. As we know, there is a business cycle, and sometimes there are recessions and sometimes there are depressions. So there are these economic crises that often happen within free markets. That's something that happens. What Marx says is this wage system is immoral and evil. It's a system of slavery. Workers should share in the profits of whatever is produced. So if you today worked at an auto plant or something, and you're building cars, whatever the cars sell for, the workers who built it should share in the profits, that sort of thing. Instead of, workers making a salary or wages and upper management making more and owners and all of that stuff. That's what he's talking about. What he also says is, what's going on within the capitalist world is that fewer and fewer people are owning the wealth. That is, rich businesses buy up other businesses. They buy up other businesses. They establish monopolies. He said, ultimately, it's going to collapse on itself because all the money is going to be in few hands, so nobody's going to buy what's built. But he says, you can't wait for that. You have to have a revolution that overthrows the bourgeoisie and puts the working class in charge, in which everything is run by the state and the working class represents the state. They run the factories as well, and economic equality prevails. And economic equality means you work according to your abilities and you're rewarded according to your needs. Some people are just better than others. Some people are more efficient. That is, they may be better workers. Think of communist societies later on, because communism and Marxism, pretty much the same thing, where you had professional athletes who played, like in professional tennis, for instance. They often had to share the amount of money they made. They only got to keep a small amount because their ability allowed them to earn a lot, but they couldn't. They promote economic equality in the communist world, so they only get to keep a little amount of it, and the rest of it is taken by the state to distribute to others. And what he says, once you have true communism, overthrowing the bourgeoisie, economic equality, credit in the hands of the state running the economy, class struggle would end, because everything we want, we're going to have. All of our needs will be met. We don't need to struggle anymore. It says ultimately the state is going to disappear. We'll just all love each other and get along and share, and war would end and all the bad stuff would end. He's got some interesting ideas, and he's got some interesting critiques of capitalism. But a number of people have pointed out people are different. We're not bees. We're not ants. Perhaps human beings, our biological nature, human nature, something that exists, is perhaps not best suited for Marxism. And as we know, wherever Marxism and communism have been established, it's led to massive, massive bloodshed, millions and millions of people dying, police states that brutalize populations, and massive, massive poverty as well. It has not worked. So whatever flaws capitalism have are nowhere near what has happened within Marxism and communism. But anyway, it's very influential. Socialism is very influential. We'll see later on that socialism influences some of the ideas that political liberals are going to embrace. So anyway, another ideology that comes out at this time is something called Romanticism. It is a movement among the arts and culture and in music. It is a cultural movement that is sort of a rejection of the emphasis on reason that came out of the Enlightenment. What the Romantics believe is that reason is no better than getting at the truth of something than your emotions are. So they stress the value of emotions. Not necessarily a poem that is written in iambic pentameter or whatever. You write a poem that is passionate, and who cares whether there is any form to it or not. You just write about your emotions. A piece of music should be as emotional as possible. Embrace your emotional side, embrace your feelings, because some of these romantic poets and others to lead really, really kind of passionate lives that are a bit interesting, all the things they do. They really do embrace their emotions and do a lot of stuff. But a big part of this is nature as well. You celebrate nature. You can think about a factory and the factory town with the soot and the filth. They celebrate nature, the the beauty of nature, the flowers, the trees, the beauty of the outdoors is vastly superior to what you're going to find in these filthy, filthy cities. So what they do is sort of a number of these people are going to act like dropouts. They don't like the values at that time. So let's drop out and embrace some alternative ideas. A number of the romantics are very critical of industrialization. William Blake, one of the great poets in Jerusalem, looks at these industrial sounds, writes to Jerusalem, looks at the mass poverty and filth, the horrible conditions that people work in and live in. And he writes, what would Jesus think? Here's the verse he uses, of these dark satanic mills. William Wordsworth, another romantic poet, talking about industrialization, the close and overcrowded haunts of cities where the human heart is sick. They really reject this whole notion of industrialization and rationalism. One of the great romantic composers is a guy by the name of Beethoven, who bridged there's a period just before Romanticism in classical music. It's called the Classical Age. That's the time when you had Mozart, for instance, writing. Beethoven comes after that. And he introduces a new style, a new type of music in there during this time. One of the things, unlike the harpsichord that Mozart had, you have a piano that Beethoven has, where you can press down on a pedal and extend a note. You have more keys. And he's really a marvelous composer. He writes Eroica. Napoleon later has a falling out with Napoleon. But one of his great works of romanticism is his Symphony No. 6, which I recommend that you listen to. You can go on YouTube and listen to that. His interpretation of nature. It's a really, really nice piece. So Beethoven, he's that bridge between an earlier form of classical music called the classical era to the romantic era. Highly emotional guy. Now, what's going on at this time? A lot of people don't know about this. It seems like 1848 doesn't matter to a lot of people. But in Europe, 1848 is a year of revolution, except for two places. Russia, which has the most autocratic, dictatorial system, brutal czars in Russia that crack down on any dissent, and Britain, that by 1948 has decided that the best way to avoid revolution is to enact some liberal reforms. The thing about it, though, the rest of Europe has revolutions. They start in France, they spread to Austria, to the German states, and they spread all around, even into Italy. All over the place, there are these revolutions. They tend to not work well. That is, initially, they tend to be successful. Governments extend voting rights to the people. They create the idea that you're going to have a more democratic government that emerges after these revolutions. But within a couple of years, the conservative forces regroup, rebound, send in the military, crush the opposition, and you have systems in place, political systems in place that were very much like the systems before these changes were demanded, before the revolution. As I said, the revolution breaks out first in France. One of the things that happens, if you remember the Irish potato famine, that has repercussions in France. There's a series of bad harvests. Again, are people guided by ideologies for change that says we want a democracy, universal manhood suffrage, that sort of thing? We want a reduction in working hours, those sorts of things. Or are they guided by the fact that they can't afford food? It's a combination of those. You have an educated population calling for liberal reforms, and then you have ordinary people who just take to the streets complaining that they can't afford food. And so what you have is a revolution. The workers get arms. They put up barricades in France. King Louis Philippe looks at the situation and says, see ya, I'm out of here. He flees. So France is going to get a new government. There you go. We had the French Revolution that ended with Napoleon. We had a revolution that got rid of Charles, and now we have a revolution that gets rid of King Louis Philippe. The French do like their revolutions. They won't end there. We'll get to some later on. So what you have is a new government, a temporary government, a provisional government that enacts some changes. Slavery, by the way, is going to be abolished. The British did that. America is going to have to get involved in a civil war that's done that, although slavery has been abolished. Slave trade has been abolished, the Atlantic slave trade. And slavery is largely abolished in the north of America, but they abolished slavery. They adopt democracy, not for women, but voting rights for men, universal manhood suffrage, and a workday of about 10 hours is what's going on at this time. So here you have France, new government in place, people elected to this government, and people elected just like in America today. It's not like people agree politically. And at this time in France, you have different types of people. You got moderates, liberals, radicals, socialists who want different things. Initially, the socialists get their way and they create something called national workshops in France and a number in Paris, where the government hires people to do whatever is needed to be done or just pays them not to do anything. It's a government job to eliminate unemployment. So you hire people. The problem is it's going to drain the treasury. It's expensive to just hire people to like sweep off a road and then dump leaves back on the road and have somebody else come sweep it off after that. You're paying people to do things that don't need to be done often. And so it drains the treasury. And there gets to be a clash between liberals and moderates against the socialists. One thing that comes out of this is the national workshop in Paris is going to be shut down. And they tell all those people who were hired and now lost their job, go to the countryside, find a job. Instead, they rebel. But at this time, the government gets its army together and sends out the troops and starts shooting troops, kills and wounds thousands of people. In an election that occurs in 1848, a guy by the name of Louis Napoleon, he's got a great name, he is the nephew of Napoleon, is going to be elected president in this democracy. But within 4 years, like his uncle, he is going to declare himself emperor. So instead of creating a democracy, you're going to end up with another conservative government with an emperor in charge. Similar things happen elsewhere in the Austrian Empire. Hungary rebels. Hungary is part of Austria. Austria is divided into a number of ethnic groups. There are 11 major ethnic groups. There are Croatians, there are Serbians over there. There are Poles within Austria. There are Austrians. Austrians are a minority within their own empire. There are Czechs. There are Slovaks, and they don't particularly get along. And some of them begin to demand independence. And initially it works. Hungary, yes, we might have to give you independence. Clemens von Metternich, who was still around, he gets out of there. The emperor decides, yeah, I better give in to the demands of some of these people, or else I might be gone as well. But then the emperor regroups. He gathers his army and he enlists the aid of Russia, and he divides one nationality against the other. He promises something to one nationality if they go after another one. So he plays nationalities against each other. They don't particularly like each other in this empire, that they are divided. It is a multi-ethnic, multicultural empire. And the Russians intervene, the military intervenes, and by 1948, things really aren't drastically different. There's some changes we'll talk about, but not drastically different. The Russian military invades, helps suppress the revolution. The Russians didn't want a revolution in Russia as well. So they helped put down this revolution. So you can see, here's the Austrian Empire, big old chunk of change here. You know, Czechs and Slovaks, you got Poles over here, Hungarians, Romanians over here, and different Slovaks and Slovenes and all kinds of different other people within that empire. Another thing where you have a revolution is within the German states and individual German states, Prussia being the most important one. Prussia sounds like Russia. This is Prussia. This is where a bunch of Germans live. This is Russia. These are Germans. Prussia is German. It's a powerful German kingdom. It's part of the German Confederation. At this time, workers there, others rebel. The middle class rebels and says, we need to end absolute monarchy in Prussia and elsewhere and have a constitutional form of government. And the Prussian king says, yes, we'll do that. Why? He wants to stay in power. He's afraid of what's going on. Meanwhile, another thing going on within Germany is that a group of educated Germans from across Germany, lawyers, professors, and others get together, meet in Frankfurt, Germany, to write a constitution to create a new country called Germany. This happens in 1848. This is the Frankfurt Assembly. So they're going to write a new constitution in Germany. The problem is, when you look at this map, here's Germany. Austrians are also German. They're a different group, but they're German. Bavarians are German, they're Catholic. The Prussians up here, they're Protestant. Do you include the Austrian emperor? Do you put him in charge, or the king of Prussia, which is, look back at the map, Prussia is the largest territory. Austria is pretty big. Who's going to be in charge? Well, they can't decide at the Frankfurt Assembly. And then all of a sudden, William IV of Prussia has decided, I'm just going to reassert my authority. He gathers his army, and Austria as well. The Austrian emperor says, I'm not interested in this. Y'all go away. And this assembly just sort of withers away. And not a great deal of changes. Some changes occur. But as I said, for the most part, the end of 1848 or in 1842, as it is in France, things don't look drastically different from the way they were just before that revolution. And it's important here because a number of people look at the German situation. Why didn't Germany become a country at this time? Perhaps this late development that Germany has in becoming a country is one of the reasons why we end up with World War I and World War II, which are just bloodbaths in Europe. So we will stop right there.